Did an African really help to eradicate smallpox? The smallpox epidemic of 1721 was more devastating than any that Boston, Massachusetts had ever faced. Sickness ravaged the city, killing hundreds at a time when there was no knowledge or understanding of infectious diseases or modern medical treatment. Colonists were terrified. The survival of the city laid in the hands of a man who had been captured from Africa and sold into slavery. Who was this African? Welcome to the Sankofa Pan African series. Please subscribe and turn on your notification buttons. Also, please support us by signing up as a member of this channel and pledging a monthly token amount to this channel through Patreon. No amount that you pledge is too small, and your pledge will ensure that we are able to continue bringing you this channel. Thank you. Unfortunately, the only name that we now have for that African who helped to eradicate smallpox is Onesimus, which is the name that he was given as a slave. The name that he was given at birth, just like the name of the exact place of his birth, from which he was captured in Africa, are all lost. It is, however, believed that he may have been an Akan from the country that we now know as Ghana, because his slave master wrote that he was Guramanti, which was a corruption of Koromanti. It is believed that Onesimus was brought to North America as a slave. He was first documented as living in Boston in 1706. And in December of that same year, he was given as a gift by a church to a minister whose name was Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather was one of the prominent figures in the Salem witch hunt, the infamous Salem witch trials. Now, Mather named the man who was given to him as a gift Onesimus, which means useful. And he named him after the runaway slave that was recorded by St. Paul in the Bible. The Onesimus in the Bible was converted by Paul, and there are records of his life, of that other Onesimus, in the book of Philemon in the Bible. Now, Cotton Mather recognized that Onesimus, the African Onesimus, was highly intelligent, and perhaps seeing himself as a modern-day Paul, taught Onesimus to read and write. While serving the Mather family, Onesimus negotiated with his master, who allowed him to work for others so he could earn some wages. He was also able to marry and had 2 children, who unfortunately both died. Mather then tried to take advantage of Onesimus' grief after he lost his children to try and convert him to Christianity, but he resisted. Now, disease was an inexplicable part of life in New England from the beginning of the Great Migration of the 1630s, when all these Mayflower ships and all of that brought people from Europe. Smallpox and other kinds of diseases were brought along with the very ships that brought so many families from Europe to New England. Smallpox was just one of the deadliest afflictions of that period. Smallpox patients experienced fever, fatigue, and a crusty rash that could leave disfiguring scars. In up to 30% of cases, it actually killed. It was a very fatal disease. The colonists saw its effects not just among their own community, but they saw how it almost wiped out the Native Americans whom they infected with the disease. Smallpox destroyed so many native communities because it was alien to them, and so they had no immunity to fight off the virus. Now, there were several outbreaks of smallpox in Boston. These epidemics killed hundreds of Bostonians. And this was at a time when the population of that city was not so large. So the number of people who died amounted to a large percentage of the population. Meanwhile, hundreds of residents of the bustling colonial town of Boston had started to flee for their lives. They were terrified of what might happen if they exposed themselves to the frequently deadly outbreak of smallpox. Even the local leaders were desperate to develop public health policies, and so they tried to get people to bury their dead very quickly. They made them fly red flags over houses where people were affected, and they tried to quarantine ships with sick sailors at a Spectacle Island in Boston Harbor. So they made ships stay there if they had sick people over a period of time before they allowed them into Boston. However, Bostonians were always afraid of the next epidemic because outbreaks had become frequent and were always just over the horizon. It was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when the next outbreak would come. And not, now, despite all the precautions that the city tried to take, it was just they kept having issues with the outbreak after outbreak. Although they did not know it, luckily for the residents of Boston, Cotton Mather, Onesimus's master, had actually asked Onesimus if he had ever had smallpox. Cotton Mather, who had come close to pursuing a medical career before becoming a minister, had continued to take a keen interest in medicine. So he had heard about inoculation practices in other parts of the world and had asked Onesimus if he had ever had smallpox. Onesimus's reply to the question was yes and no. He went on to explain that he had been inoculated with a small amount of smallpox, which had left him immune to the disease. Impressed, Mather asked for more details, which Onesimus gave him. He also showed him a scar where he had been cut before fluid from an infected person had been dropped to inoculate him when he was still in Africa. Onesimus told him that because of that operation, he would be forever protected from getting smallpox. He also explained that whoever had the courage to do the same thing will be forever free of the contagion. So the operation that Onesimus described is also known as variolation, and it involved rubbing pus from an infected person into an open wound on the arm. Once the infected fluid was introduced into the body, the person who underwent the procedure was inoculated against smallpox. This form of inoculation is different from vaccination. because vaccination comprises exposure to a less dangerous virus in order to provoke immunity. What the inoculation did was to activate the recipient's immune response so the person could be protected against the deadly disease. In spite of this, his racial prejudice, Cotton Mather believed what Onesimus told him. He was also able to confirm that the procedure which Onesimus described was also known by other enslaved Africans. So to the enslaved Africans, it was not new. I mean, those who were actually brought from Africa, a number of them had actually been variolated or inoculated because it was something that was generally practiced in Africa. Now, he then became an advocate for inoculation. That is, Mather became an advocate for inoculation and started to spread the word throughout Massachusetts, hoping that enough people would become inoculated and thereby help prevent smallpox. What Mather underestimated was the level of prejudice that other members of his community had against anything African. It was the same prejudices that had actually caused him to initially distrust Onesimus, and which also made him to keep him enslaved, even when after he realized how smart and intelligent and industrious Onesimus was. Other white colonists, however, did not only refuse to be treated using a system that had been devised by Africans, but they attacked Mather for even suggesting that any good could come out of doing so. A local newspaper, the New England Courant, ridiculed Mather for thinking that the procedure which he learned from an African could work, and an explosive device was thrown through his window with an angry note. I mean, it was people were just so mad at him for even suggesting that something that Africans did could save them. Other preachers also argued that it was against God's will to expose his creatures to dangerous diseases. I mean, that's how ignorant religion can make people sometimes. But in 1721, when there was another outbreak of smallpox, Mather convinced a doctor named Zabdiel Boylston, who was the only physician in Boston who was prepared to test the technique that Onesimus had described to his master. Boylston actually tested it on his own son and his enslaved workers by inoculating them against the disease. Boylston also started inoculating other Bostonians who, I think, so scared by the disease, decided to try the method anyway. Out of over 200 people that Boylston inoculated, only 6 succumbed to the disease. This was a great achievement when compared to the people who were not inoculated. The smallpox wiped out over 14% of the population of Boston, which meant 7 out of every 10 people who were not inoculated died during that particular epidemic. This was what convinced more people that the procedure was viable. By 1796, an effective vaccine that used cowpox to activate smallpox immunity was developed by Edward Jenner. Eventually, smallpox vaccination became mandatory in Massachusetts. Unfortunately, there is no evidence to show that Onesimus enjoyed any benefit from the role that he played in saving so many lives and the eventual eradication of smallpox. According to Stephen J. Niven, In order to obtain a partial freedom, Onesimus even had to give Mather money to purchase another enslaved person. Mather placed other conditions on his release, requiring that he remained available to perform work in the Mather household at their command. The WHO declared smallpox entirely eradicated due to the spread of immunization worldwide in 1980. It is the only infectious disease that has been fully eradicated thanks to the knowledge that enslaved Africans like Onesimus took with them into captivity. Thank you very much for watching. Please don't forget to share our videos with your contacts and give us a thumbs up. And please support us by signing up as a member of this channel and pledging a monthly token amount to us through Patreon. No amount that you pledge is too small, and whatever you pledge will ensure that we're able to continue bringing you this channel. Thank you.